Part 6 of the Shergold Weir Report. Welcome back. Let's go on with the recommendations. So recommendation number 8. Collaboration with fire authorities in the development of fire safety design. So the problem that was identified. Fire authorities play a role in building approvals processes in all jurisdictions. However, the triggers for their involvement differ. The resourcing of fire authorities to perform their role and approaches to the approvals process differs across jurisdictions. This results in similar buildings in different jurisdictions having different requirements imposed upon them by the fire authorities. There is consensus that, at a minimum, fire authorities should provide comment on or consent to performance solutions that involve fire performance requirements that relate to fire brigade intervention. So, stepping a commentary on this, if you have a building and you have a particular, fire issue, and part of your solution would perhaps involve maybe having refuge floors on parts of the building and then access to it by fighting or fire brigade as an intervention, as a performance solution, that would involve their input. Now, I'm not saying that's happening in Australia. That's taken from some examples in Hong Kong, but it's just an example for you to appreciate. So back to the report. However, fire authorities will sometimes want to consider and may object to broader aspects of the fire engineering design. The mechanisms for fire authorities to object to fire engineering designs differs across jurisdictions. In many, fire authorities have limited or no appeal rights. As a consequence, differences of opinion remain unresolved. And you have to remember, this is a work environment for them. So, fire authorities lack confidence that buildings will comply with the minimum fire safety requirements of the NCC. This concern seems justified given the prevalence of non-compliant combustible cladding on commercial buildings. Measures need to be taken to improve compliance levels and to ensure a suitable level of engagement with fire authorities in the fire engineering design process. The International Fire Engineering Guidelines have been endorsed by the fire safety industry and is published by the ABCB. It contains best practice for the development of fire engineering designs and includes an obligation to engage with fire authorities as part of the design process. It has been reported to us that if the IFEG was closely followed, the quality of fire engineering designs would improve and fire authorities would be consulted early on. All designs involving performance solutions as part of a fire engineering design process. This would help fire authorities gain confidence in the capabilities of fire safety engineers to design acceptable fire safety solutions. Unfortunately, the IFEG is not consistently followed by fire engineers across Australia, and its status is limited given that fire engineers are not registered practitioners in most jurisdictions. That seems like an oversight, doesn't it? It really does. So recommendation 8, that consistent with the International Fire Engineering Guidelines, each jurisdiction requires developers, architects, builders, engineers, and building surveyors to engage with fire authorities as part of the design process. Implementing the recommendation. The present edition of the IFEG was published in 2005. However, the IFEG is scheduled to be updated this year. The most effective means of establishing best practice for fire engineers and building surveyors will be to formulate a nationally consistent code of conduct for fire engineers and building surveyors based on the IFEG. A failure to comply with the code would establish a grounds for disciplinary inquiry, and regulatory oversight would be required to audit compliance. The development of such a code should be undertaken in collaboration with fire authorities and the fire safety industry. Further observation. As noted above, the role of the fire authorities in building approvals differs across jurisdictions. In some cases, the involvement of fire authorities is a source of frustration because of their lack of resourcing for this role. There are complaints that some fire authorities oppose designs on issues which are beyond their expertise. Furthermore, there is lack of consistency in interpretation of the NCC. these matters impact on the effective implementation of the NCC. Given the diversity of opinion within the industry, the BMF may wish to consider whether a separate review of the role of fire authorities in building approvals across Australia should be undertaken with a view of addressing the issues raised. That seems like a very good idea, this further observations that they've made. Because you're right, you may have different people in the same organization giving you different answers for the same problem. So recommendation 9, integrity of private building surveyors. So the problem identified. The building approvals system in all jurisdictions rely on certification by private building surveyors. Even in jurisdictions in which building approvals are issued by local government, private building surveyors or other registered practitioners can issue certificates. Legally, they can be relied on by local government without the need for substantive review when issuing the final approval. Consequently, in all jurisdictions, private building surveyors have a direct commercial relationship with designers, owners, and builders. They depend on them for their financial viability. And, yep, that's an obvious conflict of interest, isn't it? This makes them susceptible to the interests of their client in ways which may not always align with the public interest. They make decisions independent of government with limited substantive review. As a result, conflict of interest are inherent in all compliance and enforcement systems across Australia. Just think about that. In all jurisdictions. Most jurisdictions have legislative controls to mitigate conflict of interest. However, there is substantial variation across jurisdictions. In some instances, the controls are open to broad interpretation, making them difficult to enforce. Some jurisdictions prohibit the appointment of building surveyor to issue the building approval from participating in the design process. This is because a building surveyor who has a substantive involvement in the preparation of the design may not be independent in certifying the design. That's true. That is very true. And what they can tell you in the design, they may have to change their mind on later. What if they made a mistake? Stepping back into the report. In practice, it is common that a designer will seek the views of a building surveyor about how compliance may be achieved, and it is generally accepted that the building surveyor will assist with those queries. However, the interpretation of how much advice can be given before the surveyor is seen to be participating in the design differs markedly. Exactly. They can't even. Some surveyors will try and tell you what to do in the design. You go, no, that's not your role. Some people will want them to tell you what to do. So recommendation 9, that each jurisdiction establishes minimum statutory controls to mitigate conflict of interest and increase transparency of the engagement and responsibility of private building surveyors. So implementing the recommendation, conflicts of interest need to be addressed comprehensively. The following matters should be legislated as a minimum: that it is the owner. Okay, sorry. That it is the owner who appoints a building surveyor personally or through an agent. That's fantastic, because the issue is you'll have the builder appointing them on a lot of the NC projects. That where an agent is used, the arrangement should be subject to a requirement that the owner be given information throughout the building approvals process. That the engagement of a building surveyor be documented, and that termination of that engagement must not occur without the approval of a regulator or unless a mandatory process is followed. That the acceptance of an appointment of a building surveyor and the carrying out of any functions be prohibited where the building surveyor has participated in the design of the building, or there is a direct or indirect pecuniary interest in the design or builder or work, or the building survey is related to a person with any aspect of the above interest. Any surveyors watching this, what do you think about these requirements, guys? These all sound pretty good. That the obligations relating to the acceptance of certificates from other registered practitioners are clearly set out. That is, the checks that the surveyor must make and document when accepting certificates from others. That the owner and builder are required to be sent key documents directly from the building surveyor throughout the building approval process, including an approved fact sheet on the roles and responsibilities of their building surveyor, information about the surveyor's complaints management procedures, all approved documents forming part of the building approval, any approved variations to documents or new design documents approved during the works, results of all mandatory inspections as they occur, any directions issued following mandatory inspections, any enforcement action taken by the surveyor, any occupancy certificates or final inspection certificates, and that the owner has the right of appeal against decisions of the building surveyor. Further observations. Not all jurisdictions place a prohibition on building surveyors participating in design and development. Some see it as crucial or critical to mitigating perceived conflicts of interest. Other jurisdictions have a variety of different controls. Minimum statutory controls need to be clearly defined and applied consistently across Australia. Audit and enforcement of such requirements need to be prioritised for regulators. On complex projects, the design team should be required to include a building surveyor who is genuinely independent from the building surveyor appointed to issue the approval. This already happens for some projects. It needs to be universal practice. That is definitely a bit of a shake-up in that industry. Recommendation 10, Codes of Conduct for Building Surveyors. The problem identified. The compliance and enforcement systems of 5 jurisdictions do not have a code of conduct for building surveyors. Wow, that's shocking. This is a weakness. Codes of conduct can be effective means of documenting the clear standards of behavior expected of professionals who have statutory responsibilities. They also provide a reference against which auditing can be carried out and disciplinary action taken when the code is not met. Without a clear code of conduct, it is difficult for regulators to question the behavior of private building surveyors. As a result, oversight and disciplinary action can be challenged. We found only 2 jurisdictions in which the licensing bodies had suspended or cancelled the registration of private building surveyors. This suggests that the regulatory oversight of building surveyors across Australia has been limited and ineffective. Unprofessional behaviour needs to be exposed and appropriate action taken. Recommendation 10. That each jurisdiction put in place a code of conduct for building surveyors which addresses the key matters which, if contravened, would be a grounds for disciplinary inquiry. Okay. Implementing the recommendation. Although the role of private building surveyors in the building approval process differs across jurisdictions, the kinds of services they offer are similar as is the inherent potential for conflict of interest. Agreement should be reached on the core content to create nationally consistent code of conduct. The code of conduct should have statutory authority. Key issues need to be addressed. At a minimum, each jurisdiction's code of conduct should include the following. The primary obligations of the building survey is to ensure compliance with legislation and to act in the public interest. Building surveyors must not prepare performance solutions, but may assess and approve performance solutions prepared by others. This is interesting. I want to step away for a moment here because you have some building surveyors are also acting as accessibility consultants and providing performance-based solutions to get around DDA requirements for the disability code. Would you consider that a conflict of interest if they're doing it on the one job? I don't mind if they do it in multiple roles for different projects, but on the one job, big conflict. Building surveyor, and back to the report, building surveyors must not participate in the development of the design. The code must set out clearly and unambiguously what is meant, what this means in practice. Building surveyors must act within their area of skill and expertise, regardless of the scope of their registration. Building surveyors must have mechanisms in place to encourage owners to advise of any concerns about non-compliant work, and building surveyors must have policies and procedures for the proper management of complaints from owners, adjoining owners, builders, and regulators. Wow, it's some meaty proposals. I think that would be. Well, I'm surprised there isn't a code of conduct. I'm sure the professional bodies of surveyors exist, but For the role that they play in the building industry, there should be a consistent national code of conduct. So, recommendation 11, the role of building surveyors in enforcement. The problem identified. Sorry, I need a coffee. Okay. In most jurisdictions, private building certifiers have a statutory responsibility to inspect work during the construction phase and determine whether it accords with the building approval and the NCC. As part of this oversight role, private building surveyors are well placed to detect fraudulent conduct and non-compliant building work. They scrutinize what is happening on a day-to-day basis and have reliable intelligence on the performance of practitioners. Establishing ways to work with private building surveyors in order to collect this information in a collaborative way would lead to more effective enforcement processes. When certifying building approval documentation, building surveyors have on occasion been presented with fraudulent documentation to support the proposed use of products. In some instances, products are substituted by builders without notice to the building surveyor. When the building surveyor becomes aware of this, they do not necessarily notify regulators. Whether or not these instances are widespread, this is a general perception that such failures can occur within the existing procedure for checking compliance. And you can imagine that that would be a major issue, a potential for conflict of interest. When private building surveyors conduct mandatory inspections and/or issue occupancy certificates, they are sometimes asked to approve work that is inconsistent with the building approval or the NCC. In these situations, it is essentially part of the building surveyor's role to issue directions to the builder and to ensure that those directions are complied with. If they are not, the matter should be escalated to a building regulator, the works stopped and/or the occupancy certificate refused. Now, the issue, stepping away and giving a commentary on that, the issue is that would be very difficult if maybe it's a builder you're working with a whole lot of projects at the same time, and then they fire you or they don't give you any more work. And word will spread. So it's difficult. It's a hell of a conflict of interest. There needs to be a more robust response to these circumstances. Otherwise, non-compliance will remain unresolved and builders will not be pursued to improve their practices or persuaded to improve their practices. Most importantly, the system of oversight would be grievously compromised. Builders may depart from approved plans or fail to call for inspections as required, whilst the building surveyor is obliged to take the necessary steps to confirm the work is compliant. They should also be required to report builders when this behavior occurs. Regulators who receive this intelligence about builders need to take appropriate risk-based action. And stepping away again, we have made complaints to the authorities here about people doing this and they were ignored ourselves. So it's frustrating. Back into the report. It is consistently reported that many private building surveyors are not inclined to take enforcement action against their clients. Exactly. They're not inclined to take enforcement action against their clients. Further, it has been suggested that when a private building surveyor refers an unresolved matter to the government authority, appropriate follow-up action is not taken. Yes, I can relate to that. I can attest to that too. Such concerns are routinely expressed in the industry, although it is difficult to gauge the prevalence or scale of the behaviours identified. It is imperative that these matters be addressed. Recommendation 11. That each jurisdiction provides building surveyors with enhanced supervisorial powers and mandatory reporting obligations. So implementing these recommendations. It is recommended that where private surveyors conduct inspections or issue occupancy certificates, they be given powers to issue directions to fix or stop work when non-compliance is detected. If the directions are not complied with within a fixed time frame, the building surveyor must refer the matter to the government. There be mandatory reporting obligations on building surveyors to report suspicious or fraudulent practices and significant departures from approved documentation to the government. There'll be training, help desks, and other support for building surveyors to assist them with drafting directions and notices. And a matter referred by a private building surveyor shall be prioritized for action by the receiving authority so that a reliable system of regulatory support is given and the matter is resolved. Further observations. Building surveyors have a duty to ensure that non-compliance is detected and documented. They must give clear direction to the builders for rectification. If the builder does not comply with the directions, the owner should be notified and the matter escalated to a resourced local, state, or territory government that can respond expeditiously. A mandatory reporting regime could include giving private building surveyors the ability to anonymously report problem designers and builders to the regulator or to submit ratings on the performance of the practitioner with whom they engage. If information about these referrals was sent to a state or territory government, the information would be a source of intelligence about problem practitioners and common non-compliances. It could inform, educate, and audit activity. It would also be easier to detect patterns of non-compliance by particular builders or designers, which may support disciplinary action. Recommendation 12. Collecting and sharing data and intelligence. The problem identified. The building approvals process in each jurisdiction requires documentation to be created before, during, and on completion of building work. The systems provide for documentation and other notifications to be lodged with the relevant council or territory at various stages of building work. In some jurisdictions, there is also some form of mandatory reporting to a state or territory authority. Unfortunately, despite requirements for record creation and keeping, key information is not readily accessible or auditable. The recent cladding audits have demonstrated that the ability to identify buildings for audit and to examine building approvals documentation in a comprehensive manner has been challenging for some jurisdictions. It is frequently difficult to access all the relevant documents about the construction of a building, especially when the building has been sold. Important assumptions and requirements that underpin the design and performance solutions for the building are not always available to subsequent owners. This has become a bigger issue as the complexity of buildings and their fire safety systems have increased, especially when performance solutions have been used. The insurance industry suggests that commercial building owners who have access to and are able to maintain detailed building construction and maintenance documents for buildings are likely to benefit from lower premiums. Now that is a very interesting comment there. Stepping away and giving a commentary on that, that seems like a fantastic way to encourage people to actually keep records and documents. If a consistent approach to the recording of information was taken by each jurisdiction, information sharing and data analysis to inform regulatory decision-making will be enabled. This would also enable authorized persons to access key information about the construction and approval of buildings, leading to greater transparency and auditability. It would strengthen public accountability. So, recommendation 12 is that each jurisdiction establishes a building information database that provides a centralized source of building design and construction documentation. That seems like a fantastic idea, and implementing this recommendation, it is imperative that jurisdictions collaborate with a view to ensure that the central database enables intelligence sharing. This will inform each other's compliance and enforcement activities and the work of the BMF. At a minimum, there needs to be agreement on the key data points that are congruent across all jurisdictions upon which reliable information can be shared. It is proposed that information about the construction of buildings should be lodged on a progressive basis during construction and post-occupancy, and that post-occupancy fire safety system maintenance reports should also be lodged. The database should have information about all commercial buildings as a priority, but could also contain information about domestic buildings. Preferably, the information will be collected and stored in a digital form using emerging technologies. Now, giving a commentary on that, you would be surprised if you're going to do work on an existing building, how hard it is to get actual information about the building. Some people, all the drawings, documents may be all over the place, may be lost. It just seems insane in the modern world. So going back into the report, information contained should be the name of the appointed surveyor or issuing authority, a description of the proposed building works. Okay, so this is just the level of detail, so we're not going to go into that. So further observations. New digital technologies provide effective ways for collecting and analyzing information and providing ready access for regulators and building owners. With developing technology, it is now becoming feasible to have all building approvals documentation recorded electronically. Jurisdictions have realized that lodging of documents across dozens of local councils is problematic when information is needed for auditing and enforcement actions. Consequently, most jurisdictions are in the process of developing centralized data platforms. Jurisdictions should collaborate with each other on these projects. They need to reach agreement on the types of information collected so that it can be readily shared and analyzed on a national basis in order to inform regulatory activities and the work of the BMF. To implement this recommendation, further work could usefully be undertaken by the BMF to identify the most appropriate technology to interface with each jurisdiction's data platform. Emerging technologies such as blockchain should be considered for suitability. Potentially, just stepping away, the using of unalterable blockchain for this process might be a perfect application for it. Potentially, it might provide a virtual ledger of all regulatory transactions in a verifiable and auditable format. You can even allow the public to have access to it. It is recommended that further work examine how the building information management, data procurement framework, and build offsite property assurance scheme and other similar emerging digital solutions could be relevant to the establishment of these databases. Access to the information in these central databases would need to be limited to authorized persons. Boring. The extent of such access would need to take into account consideration of privacy, national security, and the protection of intellectual property and design. Okay, I understand. Disappointed though. Imagine doing an ether search on all the building information. However, it will be important to give owners and potential purchasers of building a suitable level of access to provide a level of transparency about the building's approval process. At a minimum, the public needs to be assured that the compliance mechanisms involved in the construction can easily be assessed and verified by authorized personnel. So guys, I am going to call that, finish up this part at that recommendation, and I will continue on with the next one next time. Please like, share, subscribe. Let me know what you think about these recommendations. Do you think it's a little bit too late? Are you surprised that some of these things aren't actually in place? Thank you all very much. See you next time. Bye for now.